Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Hello to everyone who's slowly streaming into the Zoom webinar, and hello to everyone who's joining us on YouTube as well. My name's Aidan. I'm one of the researchers here at Reform Think Tank, and I'll be chairing this conversation today about how government plans for the worst. I'm going to hold off starting for a couple of minutes, just because it can take a moment for people to join the Zoom stream, so I don't want to start too early, and also for people to join the YouTube live stream as well. So I'm going to stall for a minute or two just to wait for everyone to come in, and then I'll kick off with a very quick introduction. But I can already see that people are slowly joining, so that should be fine. Okay, up to 35 now. I'll give it 30 seconds and then we'll kick off. Okay, we're leveling off a bit now and there are people on the YouTube stream, so I think I'll make a start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to our fantastic panel of attendees. A fantastic panel of speakers. My name is Aidan. I'm part of the research team here at Reform, and I'm going to be chairing this discussion about how government plans for crises. We have a really excellent panel here to discuss this with a very varied background, so I hope that the audience members have some good questions to ask. This pandemic, coupled with Brexit preparedness, have been a huge test of the British state. They've exposed weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our core public services. They have exposed the fact that our machinery of government might not have been prepared to respond fully to a crisis of this scale. And this has been coupled with the fact that some of the impacts of the pandemic might not have been anticipated. And if they were anticipated, they might not have been mitigated against. Now, it would be wrong to draw conclusions at this stage about what had gone wrong in the government's response to the pandemic. There will be government inquiries that will draw those conclusions. But at this stage, we can ask some more fundamental questions about what the government does to prepare for emergencies. So today, we want to be asking our panelists, how do we plan for crises? How do we make sure that those plans are realistic and actionable? If the unthinkable happens, how do we make sure that those plans are implemented well? And at this moment where we can start to look forward to the recovery from the pandemic, how can we use this moment to learn lessons about how we responded to this crisis in order to make us more resilient as a country when the next one comes? So joining us to ask these questions today, we have a really fantastic panel. James Wild MP, James, who's just joined us, who is the MP for North West Norfolk. James sits on the Public Accounts Committee, and if attendees haven't seen the Public Accounts Committee, have recently been publishing reports on the government's response to COVID-19, including whole of government planning. So we'll definitely be interested to hear from him about that. James was also previously a special advisor in the Ministry of Defence, the Cabinet Office, and also in the Prime Minister's Brexit unit in Number 10. So we'll definitely have some questions about the preparedness exercises that he saw while he was there. Next, we have Bruce Mann. Bruce had a long career in national security in the Ministry of Defence and the Cabinet Office. And for 5 years, from 2004 to 2009, Bruce was the director of the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, the government's crisis planning function. So I'm sure that we will have questions for Bruce about his experiences there. And now Bruce advises governments around the world on how they can better prepare for emergencies. And lastly, we have Dr. Sarah Ulrich. Sarah works for PA Consulting, or recently joined PA Consulting from Deloitte, where she leads up Wargaming. Sarah has 20 years experience in consultancy and academia around crisis planning, wargaming and simulations. So I'll be coming to Sarah with questions about how you do wargaming properly in practice. So it's a really fantastic panel. I'm going to speak as little as possible from this point so that we can hear from them. Two housekeeping things. One, attendees, if you have questions, please can you put them in the Q&A function, not in the chat. That's the Q&A function, not the chat, because we won't be monitoring the chat. And secondly, having seen the attendee list for this event, I know that we have a really exceptionally qualified audience. So I'm really hoping that the audience members will put forward questions. You're much better placed than I am to ask interesting questions of our panelists. So please do put your questions in the Q&A, and I will try to get through as many of them as possible. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to James to start our discussion.
Unmute, sorry. Thanks very much, Aidan. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I also was also in the Ministry of Defence for 3 years as an advisor to Michael Fallon. So I was also involved in some proper wargaming with NATO exercises and things in the MOD bunker. So look forward to the discussion. So I mean, from what I've seen during my time also in the Cabinet Office and now in this PAC role, we do have the National Risk Register does set out the key natural hazards, diseases, accidents, risks, attacks, and things that the government should be planning for. And for quite some time, the impacts of a potential pandemic have been in that document, aside from just an influenza pandemic, talking about new diseases that pose a threat to the health of the population and may present, importantly, societal and economic challenges. And I think there were good plans in place for influenza, but that was the wrong pandemic. And the Public Accounts Committee, we've looked at a number of areas of the response, and we'll be looking at further ones, including PPE, very shortly. And the failure to be properly prepared for a non-influenza pandemic meant that, for example, the economic support package, which has been put in place, there weren't things on the shelf that could be drawn up. So, for example, we'll be reporting shortly on the bounce back loan scheme, which was about the third iteration of the original coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, because that scheme didn't work for micro businesses and the smallest businesses for various reasons to do with consumer credit legislation. And it was quite concerning that the Treasury hadn't considered the need for that and hadn't taken into account the economic effect of a pandemic. But it's fair to recognise, I think, that in many areas there has been a Herculean response. I was praising the response particularly around ventilators, where we went from having about 7,000 or 8,000 ventilators to the national challenge of getting 30,000 ventilators. So we have responded well, but if we'd been better prepared, then that would have been made the response more effective. Although we're not alone in that situation, every other country seemed to be scrabbling around. So I think the first point really is there needs to be a link between what's in the register and action and plans for all scenarios. That's something that the NAO and we've talked about, having contingency plans for all scenarios. We also need to test those plans. And my experience in government departments across the piece is there's a lack of focus on implementation and delivery of plans. In far too many instances, it's considered the less glamorous side of policy and policy making to actually how's this going to be put in place. It's good to have a press release and get the coverage, but actually John Manzoni, when he was Chief Executive of the Civil Service, when I was there, he'd say, fine, this is great, where's your implementation plan? And all too often there wasn't one there. So there was the Operation Cygnus exercise for global influenza in 2016, and that involved nearly 1,000 people. But one of the things I elicited in questioning with Sir Tom Scholar, the Treasury Permanent Secretary, was the Treasury weren't really involved in that. He was unaware that it had taken place, and economic responses to it did not form part of the exercise. It was a public health exercise, and that's created some of the problems that are referred to in the schemes. And the third area probably to focus on in my remarks is about the need for more challenge. So the risk register is a public document based on a classified risk assessment. What was Parliament doing? Why weren't parliamentary committees asking questions about preparedness for this? I mean, my committee and other committees are all now, in hindsight, sort of being quite tough with government, with departments, with officials, but I don't recall Parliament calling out this, and the media in the same way. And also you need to continually test the assumptions that are driving those plans. So, and also what's the engagement with industry? Obviously, supply chains and how they operate has been a massive part of this response. How involved were industry with those plans? Could more have been done? So a final thought is really, we can plan for everything, and we could buy all the sort of kit we might need in any scenario, but would people consider it good value for money? For example, if we had a huge amount of PPE for a global pandemic like we're facing, and then we didn't have one. So everyone's sort of clamoring for us now to get stockpiles of this and that, but the media could quite rapidly turn around and say that that's not good value for money. The Public Accounts Committee would undoubtedly have views on that. So I think it's quite a complicated situation, and people in the Cabinet Office and elsewhere across government are doing their best, but with more challenge and more scrutiny, with more engagement with industry and testing plans, and we perhaps could have avoided some of the issues we've faced.
Thank you very much, James, and I'll definitely come back to some of those points in my questions to follow. But first, I'm going to hand over to Bruce to give his introduction.
Thank you very much, Aidan. As you saw me nodding, agree with a great deal of what James has said. But if we're going to come back to those in questions, I'll focus on the exam question, which is on wargaming, which gets you into both the exercising part of it and actually the plans and people that underlie it. So I'm going to bridge into that area. I think Sarah is going to talk about sort of the execution of a decent exercise, war game, whatever. So I'm going to come at it from the other direction, which is what good looks like. If you're having an exercise, have a proper exercise. So what's a serious exercise? And I have half a dozen tests to say, is this thing being done properly, and is this exercise being done properly, and is what's underneath being tested properly? Because if it isn't, you're not testing the plans, you don't know they're going to work on the day, or the people. So my 6 tests, which I'll roll out. The first is, if there is a major exercise, there is absolute clarity of purpose about what you're trying to get out of it. So I have seen exercises where people sort of wander into it, have a bit of a jolly for 24 or 36 hours and then go away, and there's not a lot of learning from it. So go into it knowing what you want to get out of it. And if there isn't that clarity, Sarah may have seen some of this too, if there isn't that clarity, then frankly it's a waste of time and money, in my view. Second, part of the clarity I expect will be about the testing, development, testing and validation of plans. Those plans might or might not be wholly formed. I'd see nothing wrong with having a desktop exercise, a discussion exercise, a workshop in the very earliest stages of planning. I've done that on a number of occasions, including for pandemic influenza planning. We've got a problem here. Let's just discuss the broad shape and priorities of what the plan looks like, what the response looks like. It's perfectly respectable to test only part of the overall plan, like a single department in its agencies or public communications or whatever. But at the end of the day, there is no substitute for having a test of the whole plan, even if there are weaknesses inside it. You know there are weaknesses, you know there are warts, go and test it. Don't wait until everything is perfect. The one reservation I'd have on that is if there is a huge gap in a critical area, it does get really quite depressing. I had this on the economic side, pandemic influenza planning. James has commented on that. We could never get the Treasury engaged in either planning or exercising. And that was a huge gap, and we felt it on the day. So I'd say if you can test the plan, but it is try and get as much as in place as possible beforehand. The other thing you're probably going to do is the people side of it. Exercising is about training both individuals and about teams. So there has to be a part of it which is about training people individually and collectively, and how they all work together. I'm sure we've all seen in the middle of a highly pressurized environment, an exercise tries to get there, people behave differently or in a more exaggerated form, and that has an impact on the course of the response or of the exercise. So you're trying to understand that as well as the learning points for people. Capabilities beyond people. Clearly, any exercise will test the facilities, the communication, telecommunications links, how all of that lot works, data and information management systems, probably public communications. They're always in media management is always in any exercise, in my experience. The only reason I raise it is because, certainly in my experience, there's sometimes a reluctance to do down the line field training, live training, because it's too expensive or it's inconvenient. Actually, until you go away and test something, and this is part of testing detailed implementation, whether it's getting kit out of warehouses or putting equipment in the field and rolling it out or whatever it is, you don't work out, you don't understand some of the snags that might arise on the day. So you're sitting in a nice ivory tower in Cobra or wherever, but actually everything is going wrong around you. So field training exercises are expensive, but in my view, they're vital. So that's kind of the ecosystem. A couple of other points. Realism. There's got to be realism inside the exercise. Sometimes exercises get a bit over exaggerated. I'm sure Sarah's seen some of these. The directing staff just pile in problem after problem after problem, and it all gets a bit artificial, frankly. But the bigger risk is that people pull their punches in the design of the exercise. They don't test it hard enough. Quite often that's seen, I'm afraid, in senior managers. Do you know what? I won't play in this exercise. I'll observe. No, actually, if you would have a major part in the response to an emergency, you have got to play your role. That's quite a common phenomenon that I've seen. The other thing is, yeah, it'll be all right on the day. You don't need to test this. We know how to do this. Don't worry about exercising it. It'll be all right on the day. Again, I kind of saw that a bit from the Treasury, which was disappointing. And both of those phenomena have got to be overcome to have what is a realistic exercise. And realistic, in my view, doesn't just mean inside government. It could mean the participation of the public. It could mean the participation of Parliament, as well as the participation of the Prime Minister and ministers. So that is my next point, which is participation. Participation which is realistic. Yes, you're not always going to get the Prime Minister or ministers, but you should think realism in terms of the people who are invited to participate, even if that means going outside government and outside the public sector. Final point is an obvious one, is no exercise, in my view, whatever nature, is of any value unless there's a decent lessons identified process at the end of it. That is the fundamental point of having exercises. There has to be lessons identified. There's three drop downs from that. First of all, there has to be a culture which is willing to learn lessons. I was lucky in my time we had it. We had lessons identified exercise after every major event, most of them published, quite often run by independent experts. But there has to be a culture of people who are willing to hear implied criticism and areas for improvement. If there isn't that culture, then they're always going to struggle to make those improvements. Secondly, and here's a puff for Sarah, there's got to be a good collection process. That's got to be efficient, complete, but I would then say neutral and expert. So I am a big fan of having, for the major exercises, consultants in, expert consultants who've seen this 100 times, who know what they're looking for and are neutral and are not going to carry baggage into the conclusions that they draw. Final point is it's no good writing up a lessons report and then it's sitting on the shelf. So there has to be a machinery for moderating the conclusions, for validating, and then for pushing hard on implementation. We're back to that implementation word. I absolutely agree with it, which is about the determination of the organizations concerned to improve. That's my view on wargaming and exercising, but I'd be very happy to come back to the points that are made by James.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And we'll certainly return to that issue of how you ensure that the lessons from an exercise, or indeed the real thing, are learned when the time comes. But first, I'm going to go to Sarah for her introduction.
Thank you, Aidan. And I will pass very quickly on certain points I have in common with James, but also especially with Bruce. So just a point of clarification, maybe at the beginning, just for our audience, maybe who is not necessarily, I know there are very, very senior people there, but also those who don't necessarily know the difference between military wargaming and business wargaming. It is, the essence is the same, but really business wargaming obviously took military wargaming techniques, and it has this unique ability to create a kind of environment to pressure test plans and its leadership to help them make more informed decisions. So similarly to Bruce, it's really about content that is absolutely paramount, but it's also about behavior. And I would say, especially in the public sector, I have seen it very, very often that there is a strong need, and it would be very helpful maybe to do more of breaking those silos and bringing all the different parts of the public sector within an exercise. But what it is particularly helpful with, and why you should actually even do more of, and then I will give you an idea of what the lessons learned I have seen in my personal experience. Why it's particularly helpful is because you are actually you are creating your own solution. You are not having a death by PowerPoint experience. People are doing something. So that's why it's quite a safe environment as well, safe to fail, safe to try, but really this kind of psychological safety of exercising wargaming environment is all that matters. But the major point I have seen as well in public sector is often there is a challenge to have a system thinking on certain things, being holistic and looking at the whole ecosystem of what we are trying to achieve and test those plans in. And that is really so important to see, as I often say, the forest and the trees. So you might want to take go on the balcony, as we often say, and see what is happening down below. But you might be able also, very interestingly, to zoom in into maybe the tree itself and look at the details of the plan. And the devil is often in those details, but the devil is also in looking at it more holistically. I won't expand on what Bruce said. For me, it's also absolutely paramount, the behavioral side. I think there are 4 different areas where I would suggest the public sector maybe should do a bit more of, and I'm happy to expand that in the questions. But one is really doing more of public-private sector war games. So having this kind of public-private exchange, building this partnership muscle is absolutely crucial, especially in the current uncertain times and challenging times we are living in. And I know Bruce mentioned it, but I have to underline it again. The civil society representations, having some citizens done in the right way, participating in those war games is critical. You want to understand what they are thinking, what they would, find challenging. And there is no better way to actually have a team that would actually be real citizens and react to the testing and planning. And I think James has mentioned that, Bruce has echoed that, but it's really, wargame is only as good as actually once you have the report, you are also implementing it, and you are having looked at the gaps, the challenges, what works, what needs to be enhanced. You are actually going to do something about it. It's all good to have a shiny wargame, but if it's not integrated into a methodology as part of your planning and testing routine and doing it often, it's not necessarily very useful. Also, what I have seen recently, 2 more things, is the usefulness of a wargaming technique we call role reversal. So having the experience of being into somebody else's shoes. So we talked about the citizens. having the experience what the other side is experiencing. That is often quite powerful, especially when, not necessarily maybe with emergency preparedness types of war games, but with policy war games. So you would actually look at how the intended citizens of this policy would react, or how the kind of different organizations that are impacted by this policy, how would that feel like? And the second point as well is really looking at more what we call, I don't know if you remember in the 80s, Back to the Future, the movie saga, but really jumping into the future and coming back to today is a fantastic wargaming design that is quite powerful, where you experience what, obviously, it's always gray as a future, some positive things, some challenging things, and you come back to today and you really look at what you would like to happen, what you do not want to happen, and you actually build an action plan around that. And the final point I would make, but again, Aidan, happy to expand on any of those, and we talked about it before the webinar started. I would strongly suggest to start looking more and more when you build a scenario at what we call the perfect storm. So you have different big, meaty, challenging scenarios which come at the same time. So obviously, I'm not necessarily going to give an obvious example, but January is looming. But there is maybe something there where it would be helpful to do more of how do you prioritize with those competing challenges that put pressures on the same maybe part of the organization. How do you go about that? And going through the paces of a perfect storm scenario can be very, very powerful. But Aidan, happy to expand and discuss any of those points where helpful.
Thank you very much. And we're going to return to wargaming in a moment, but first I'm going to take a couple of steps back and start in the stage of kind of horizon scanning and trying to anticipate the problems that you might have before we start to think about how you test your plans. So my first question to the panel is going to be, how was it that we could have prepared in depth for an influenza pandemic and not for the pandemic that we've had? And when we are scanning the horizon for the kinds of problems that might befall the country, how do we know that we are looking at the full range of problems we might face? And not only the core problems, but also in the kind of business terms, the cascading effects of the different hazards that we might face. I'm going to come to Bruce first. I mean, Bruce, we've spoken about this before, and it was under your leadership in the CCS that the National Risk Register was first conceived and published. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I'll come to you first, and then I think if we can come back to Sarah.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, first of all, just to locate the National Risk Register in the ecosystem, the National Risk Register is a declassified version of the secret National Risk Assessment. So that is the document inside government which captures the risks, the major risks, which the government thinks the country faces, both malicious risks and natural hazards. I think you've asked two questions, actually, one of which is about risk identification, one of which is about risk assessment. So how do you identify all the risks? Answer, you go out and talk to a lot of people and read a lot of materials. Even then, you sometimes miss some, notoriously the economic emergency of 2008, as Her Majesty the Queen pointed out, and actually the volcanic eruptions from that unpronounceable volcano in Iceland. So in those cases, you're always going to be scrabbling to catch up when it comes to the emergency response. On the risk assessment side, a novel infectious disease, as we discussed separately, has been in the National Risk Register and therefore by assumption in the National Risk Assessment for a very, very long time. But it has always been in there right back over the last 10 years, always been in there at a lower impact than pandemic influenza. So if you read the materials, especially you watch the transition between national risk registers in 2013, 2015, 2017, you'll see that the possibility of a coronavirus epidemic, novel infectious disease, increases in likelihood, but at no stage does it increase in impact. And the impact is assumed to be 2 orders of magnitude lower than the impact of an influenza pandemic. Now, if that is the start point for planning, for preparedness and so on, the government is, on that scenario, planning for the wrong thing, planning for a smaller episode than actually occurred. So I do think after this, it's a point that James made, there is a fundamental question about the risk assessment process and what went wrong there, frankly, especially because other countries reach different conclusions. So we might or might not talk about groupthink, the role of challenge. I fundamentally agree with that. But that was, I think, the starting point for some of the problems that have occurred.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to come in on that question? Okay, in that case, I'm going to move on to a kind of follow up on that, because it's something that's been raised in the Q&A and also something that James touched on in his opening remarks, which is about scrutiny of the National Risk Register and also accountability to Parliament as well. So we've had a question in the comments about the transparency. You know, the National Risk Register has only recently been declassified, and it is important, as all of you have alluded to, that members of the public who might be affected by certain types of civil emergency are warned and informed of those emergencies. So I'll come to James with the question, how do you think we can strike a better balance between the necessary secrecy around the national risk assessment and about the government's emergency planning, but also greater transparency that would allow greater scrutiny both by the public and wider society, but also Parliament too?
Yeah, I don't think it's right to say that the National Risk Register hasn't been published until quite recently. I think it's been published for some time, but Bruce, I think Bruce is nodding, so I hope I'm right on that. But it's published as it appears on gov.uk with a nice introduction from a relatively junior minister in the Cabinet Office, rather than the sort of full weight of what it's actually there for. So I think that's why it then passes slightly unnoticed, and people think, oh, it's okay, we've got this risk register we've published, so we've got some plans in place. But picking up on some of the points Bruce is making, plan's only as good as the register's only as good as a plan. You've got to actually implement it and keeping it. It's such a cliche, but a live document that's constantly checked and reviewed and updated. And I think there certainly is a role, and it may be that a parliamentary committee, for example, wants to take on a role of having an annual hearing, for example, on the risk register and pulling in the senior people and taking evidence from industry, civil society, and others on the risks and the contingencies that are proposed. I mean, I think the striking one on this response has been the lack of planning from the economic side, and what Bruce says about getting the Treasury to sort of play in these exercises and be involved certainly came through in the evidence that we've taken in our sessions, and that sort of views probably will be familiar to anyone who's worked inside government, of the way Treasury sort of sees itself. And it's also, you need to get ministers actually involved and take part in the exercises in defence. That did happen in proper exercises, also at NATO summits, for defence summits, for example. It would be all of the defence ministers would participate in the exercise, and getting the time in ministers' diaries is always incredibly difficult. And it's the easiest thing to say, oh, well, we've got this exercise or something that's not going to happen, and meanwhile this is on the front of the Times, we need to focus on that. And it's that kind of, it's a constant thing within government of the short term, longer term, and how you do these things, but you've got to protect it, and it needs to be on the defence side. Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, took part in some of the exercises when Michael Fallon was Defence Secretary, and you've got to have the leadership and actually make clear that that is an absolute priority. And I would hope that what's happened over the last 9 months would ensure that future exercises, people will look at them afresh, so that we're better prepared.
Thank you both. Sorry for that blunder on my part about the secrecy around the National Risk Register. I think I was reading too fast. But I'll come on to Sarah now for a question about wargaming. I mean, we've raised a few different points here about why the exercises that government might be doing across different areas might not be sufficient, whether that's engagement from ministerial leadership, and also overcoming groupthink to come up with scenarios that are realistic. Sorry, you work across both the public and the private sector in business wargaming. What do you think we could be doing differently across a whole range of scenarios to make our wargaming in the public sector more effective? And also, do you think that there's anything that happened differently in the private sector that we could bring across?
Yeah, thanks, Aidan. A very good question. I really just think doing more of regular exercising wargaming, doing them more often, would be my suggestion. But as I mentioned as well, I think what is really paramount is to have this ecosystem thinking, in really having this holistic system thinking, and then obviously applying it more and crossing the bridges between public and private sector. I have to say, there is your question on the differences between public and private. It is very similar. Obviously, the ecosystem of the private sector is different, and the main lessons, obviously, for the private sector's use of business wargaming, I have observed in my experience, is that they embrace more the need of this kind of, they need to understand what all the kind of red teams, the ecosystems do. They have this need to really understand, being the competitors, the regulators, the government itself, the media, what do they do? It's a kind of immediate, more urgent need, I would say, than perhaps the public sector for obvious reasons. So that is, I think, one of the reasons why they are embracing it and doing it more often, because it's linked with their end view. But there is here a really crucial point, in my view, is that, and we mentioned that very often, and I would really reiterate it again, to see the forest and the trees is absolutely crucial. And I think if the public sector can not only embrace this partnership muscle with the private sector, as well as having the kind of more holistic view, I think that would be a very good step.
Yes, thank you. I mean, on seeing, we've spoken a little bit about silos too, and about how wargaming can happen within silos, and talking about seeing the wood through the trees. If you wargame within a kind of controlled environment and you don't have the exposure to all your areas of risk exposure, then that might create problems. In terms of planning for something that would have both a national impact and an impact across so many areas, like a pandemic, do you think that there would be value in doing kind of multi-departmental wargaming, rather than perhaps wargaming or red teaming that happens within one department to consider the risks and the vulnerabilities that might lie just there?
Yeah, Aidan, absolutely, and I'm sure there is already a lot going on into especially from an emergency blue light preparedness point of view, and they work extremely diligently to actually bring all those parts together, and we've seen that as well recently on the effect on how that has worked. I think there is a case here to be made, and apologies if I'm not using the right wording, that's my French side. It's really around the operational side of things, might be working extremely well because they have the need and they have actually integrated the simulation exercising mentality as part of what they do. I think there is a need for the strategic level to do more of strategic war games, on really having a better understanding what the operational side is doing, and then also having the kind of, like we talked about, the forest and the trees view, and that is where you would bring definitely everyone together. But the strategic versus the operational is also an interesting one.
Thank you. We're going to go, speaking of strategy, we've had a question from the audience about the role, and or Bruce and I, we've spoken about this before, Bruce, about the role of the CCS in all of this, because obviously emergency planning happens at different levels within government, and about whether the Civil Contingency Secretariat has enough power to affect change in the way that different levels of government do resilience planning. What are your views on the current powers that the CCS has, to both instruct and affect change across government? And do you think that it could have an adapted role perhaps after the pandemic?
Yeah, I find it quite hard to comment on the current CCS because I don't know it that well. I'll make a sort of ecosystem point first and then answer your question. When I was director of the CCS, I had a group of ministers and prime ministers who'd been through the tragedies of 2001, foot and mouth, flooding, a whole heap of stuff. And at no stage did I ever lack for attention from everybody up to and including 2 prime ministers if we wanted something done, that we wanted a decision or a direction or indeed investment. So actually, I think the fundamental point here is about the willingness of the, as it were, governance system. I'm going to come back to something James said, which I fundamentally agree with. The governance system to give emergency preparedness attention, focus and attention. Now, the snag is in the UK, we tend to go from spasm to spasm. We have a problem, we fix the problem, and then we let it sort of atrophy a bit until the next time when the problem comes up again and we spasm. I think we've got to find, I hope one of the things we'll take out of this pandemic is finding the way of having that sort of constant attention given to civil emergency planning and preparedness. I think the government has a part to play in that. And there are issues, I think, about governance inside government. Actually, I've seen Lord Peter Ricketts speak on this point, whether this area got sufficient attention over the decade, from the lucky decade for the UK with relatively few emergencies between 2010 and 2020, or whether it all just slightly withered. Because I think that's fundamental, the space which the director of CCS is operating within. I do absolutely agree with what James said on parliamentary attention. In my time, I had 2 pieces of parliamentary scrutiny, one on a bill we were taking through, which became the Civil Contingencies Act, and one by the Lords on a deeply esoteric piece of European law. But that was it, and I always felt the lack there. So I do think there is something about Parliament holding the government to account. I recognise that's complicated because it's cross-government work, and there are few cross-government committees, although I see both the Public Administration Committee and Public Accounts Committee in this space, which is great. But I do think we need to look at governance inside government, but also inside Parliament as well, so that this area gets constant attention. If it has, then the Director of Civil Contingencies is operating in a good place. Now, that's what I experienced. If frankly he or she is not getting attention from the political leadership or indeed the senior civil service leadership, then it's always going to be an uphill battle. There is inside here, because it comes around about every 5 years, the question about having a dedicated Minister for Resilience inside the Cabinet Office. That was looked at by the Labour government, that was looked at by the Cameron government. We could come back there, but I think that's only part of a total ecosystem which we need to get to.
Thank you. James, you just raised your hand, so I'll come to you next.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say when I was in the Cabinet Office until moving to number 10 in July last year for sort of a year or so, working for David Lidington, who had responsibility for CCS and also our response to critical national infrastructure issues. And I mean, I think they do a tremendous job, but at the time they were having to deal with Brexit planning for eventuality of no deals. Also floods come along. They also coordinated a lot of the response to the Salisbury attacks, and it's kind of when all of those things come together, that's when the system sort of held up. But if you're director of CCS, you're being pulled into lots of different directions on those issues. So having capability there is important. And I think we're probably, if we think about terrorism, for example, with the structures and things within government are more established and probably more powerful than a general sort of resilience perspective, and we need to think about that. I think to Bruce's point about, well, I remember when Oliver Letwin was in the Cabinet Office, he had a huge focus on resilience and was very worried about gas generation, for example, being flooded and very sort of black swan type events. But that was very much him sort of driving that himself. And I do think we need to have someone who's getting up every day thinking about these issues and has the ability to escalate them as necessary, whether through National Security Council or other structures, in order to get the focus that they need.
And actually, James, I might just follow up on that, because I think you've got a very interesting perspective as someone who's both been a kind of strategic advisor and is now a sitting politician. In addition to a minister for resilience, we've had a question from the audience about ministers are reshuffled so often, and every minister will have a different brief, different things to worry about, and different vulnerabilities to different civil emergencies. When perhaps historical memory is quite short in some briefs, how do you think that you can reinforce the importance of emergency planning and resilience kind of across ministerial briefs, not just in one kind of established minister for resilience in the Cabinet Office?
Yeah, it's sort of that very difficult question of people moving around a lot, but I think then you have to have a sort of institutional framework into which whoever person comes into that job arrives and then is then briefed into, and also takes part in exercises and development for them to understand how this is all meant to fit together. So I think you need to have something so that whoever comes in, essentially that's their brief and that's what they need to focus on. Obviously, you've got the kind of architecture of CCS and the National Security Advisor within that as well, who are there sort of institutionally. But I think the only way to do it is to have structures so that people, whoever comes into whichever role, and I think that's probably true across government, is there's a mechanism there that works, and they slot into it. But yeah, it is difficult if you've got, particularly Cabinet Office is one of those departments where people come in and do sort of 18 months and then move on to something else. So from a ministerial level, it's kind of getting David Liddington took a strong interest, particularly in CNI activity. But in some ways, he had to sort of create a bit of architecture for him to, as I almost said, dock into, which is getting those civil service things out of my head, but feed into. So I think that's probably is. So there's no sort of silver bullet to it, but that can help address that point.
Yeah, thank you. In the time that we've got left, I think we should focus on the lessons learned point that Bruce first made in his introduction. I think the fact we're already seeing and already identifying problems with the way that we've approached civil protection more generally, but also in our pandemic preparedness. And as we move to a point where we can start to think about the recovery from the pandemic, how can we begin to take stock of the lessons that we've learned from the experience of the pandemic, and not just to identify them, but to then build that into future preparedness exercises? So could I come back to Sarah and ask, in the wargaming exercises that you run, how do you manage that process of identifying what went well, what didn't go well, and how to ensure that those lessons are actually embedded in what the organization does next?
Yeah, Eden, this is absolutely crucial, because when you move out from the day of the war game, obviously you have done your hot debrief, you then actually collate all the useful information and create a report. It's really about how you actually take that report and those lessons learned and opportunities to improve certain areas, and actually how you cascade it through the organization. And there are different ways of going about this, but I have to say, it's really, really important to do it at all levels. That's what I have seen in my experience, and doing it quickly. So obviously you will take some time to do the report, but doing it as fast as possible, so then you can have specific focus groups to actually look at what are the major lessons learned, and having it at a strategic level, at tactical and operational level, and then bringing everyone together and have a clear action plan from that. I think that's quite paramount.
Thank you. And to follow up on that with James, James, in your time working on Brexit preparedness. Now, Brexit's got a horizon, as it were, even though there are still so many unknowns, and at this stage we don't yet know what Brexit looks like. But there have been several episodes where we thought that Brexit was going to come to some kind of conclusion and didn't. Do you have a view on the kind of preparedness exercises that you were doing for different Brexit scenarios? Was there a process of kind of continuous learning where you were identifying perhaps faults in your planning or things that hadn't been anticipated? And then as that process evolved and as Brexit preparations continued, were you kind of learning the lessons of what you were doing to prepare for Brexit as it went? Is that something that you see in government?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I straddled, so I worked for Daily Lidington when he was Theresa May's effective deputy doing a lot, and he led on sort of domestic preparedness for Brexit. And then I moved across to the number 10 Brexit unit when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. And I think it's fair to say there's definitely a sort of step change in planning under Boris Johnson. Which partly was his political view and his position on Brexit and the 31st of October. But for example, under Theresa May, there was a whole swathe of slightly overlapping cabinet committees, for example, on domestic preparedness and legislation. Whereas when Prime Minister came in, he created XS to deal with the strategy of negotiations and XO to deal with the operational side, which met in Cobra every day, including even on a Sunday. I was lucky enough to go home for a meeting, and we brought in some of the other elements that Sarah's talked about in terms of red teaming and creating much better live information sharing across government. So from the centre, you could see what was happening in the Home Office or other systems, and we did do quite a lot of testing, particularly around the processes that would operate at ports, for example, perhaps not surprisingly, and customs systems there was initially the instinct was to do sort of tabletop only exercises, whereas Michael Gove and other ministers were very keen to make sure it's proper end-to-end testing, people actually on the ground. He was not very happy when he discovered that a test at one of the ports had actually happened in a conference room in York, for example, and then made sure that people were actually testing stuff, and actually went round, I think, to most of the key sites to actually see what was happening on the ground. So yeah, I think there was far more focus on practicalities and implementation. As I say, it wasn't meeting in XO, it was really kind of operational type decisions, actions being recorded in real time and then sent out to departments. It was exhausting for the CTS folk who did a great job in sort of manning that and continue to do so today. But I think that's kind of the model that needed to be there, and is still continuing today, as the systems for customs and HMRC. Again, we took evidence on the border at the PAC last week, and there's still obviously work to be done, systems that need to be put in place, and testing and things, and opening them up to third parties to be able to access them is all kind of still underway. So yeah, the clearer structures for decision making and actual testing and getting into the weeds is very important.
And then I'll come last to Bruce, please. Bruce, your thoughts on how to make sure that lessons, either from the real thing or from an exercise, are both identified and actioned and baked into future preparedness exercises?
Yes, well, I won't repeat very much what I said, which is make sure you have got a proper process, and ideally a neutral process, for collecting all of the lessons during an exercise or indeed a real life event, and that there is a machinery which validates those and makes sure they're implemented, which has senior sponsorship. So that's the basics. I would go 2 steps further and say, for the really big events, I would like to see 2 other things, one of which is that material published, as we certainly did on my watch with the reports by Sir Michael Pitt and Dr. Anderson and Dame Deirdre Hine. And then ideally, I'm back to my parliamentary scrutiny point, there is some parliamentary process which holds the government to account for their implementation. That was done a little bit after the Lessons Identified report on the London bombings in July 2005, although it fairly rapidly petered out from memory. But I would say there's something which is about the quality of the collection process, and then the governance and oversight process, which makes both within government and outside government, which makes sure that those lessons are implemented.
Thank you. And I'm going to finish now in the 5 minutes we have left. I'm going to try and end on a positive note because there's a lot about all this that is a bit doom and gloom necessarily. Sarah, you work with lots of different businesses, public and private sector, to see how they kind of stress test their plans for different things. James, you've worked across national security risk and Brexit, and Bruce, you've seen real life major emergencies unfold and then what happens afterwards. So I'll start in the order that I see everyone. I'll go to Sarah and then James and then Bruce to finish. Should we have cause to be optimistic that this is going to be a sea change moment for how we do civil emergencies? Do you think this will be a wake-up call on some of the fronts that we've been talking about to make things better? What are your thoughts? Are you optimists or do you remain to be convinced? So Sarah first.
Aidan, I'm always an optimist. A challenge is an opportunity as well to learn. I think the crucial thing I take as a positive, and I would love to hear James and Bruce on that, is really we have experienced what we call often an outlier event. So you could call it, I know there is a big battle of experts around black swans, gray rhinos, even I heard black jellyfish recently. It's really, so having experienced that, it's an opportunity to actually look more around the corner, in the corners, to avoid those blind spots. And actually that's an opportunity for us to learn and actually embed those outliers more into our preparedness.
Thank you. James, next.
Yeah, why not be optimistic? I'm looking out my window and the snow's coming down in Norfolk and it's looking very Christmassy, so I'm optimistic. I think, I think there's been, the PAC is doing a whole host of work. Obviously, the Health and Science and Technology Committees are also doing work, and I should just note that Lord Arbuthnot's pointed out that the House of Lords have actually set up a committee looking at risk and assessment, so I wasn't aware of that, so that's a good development. The Lords leading the way. As ever, and I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned from how we prepared for this response, and it's about making sure that we don't focus on preparing for the last war and say we need to look ahead for what are the risks that are coming. But there's going to be a wealth of informed learning from these reports that are underway, and doubtless the inquiry to come, although that's going to presumably take some time. So I think there's things that we can be getting on with now, and I think making that as open a process in terms of feedback, particularly from industry and others who have sort of been called on to deliver things at great speed. And as Sarah said, they're much better at preparing and doing some of the exercises, and what can we learn, and bringing in outside thinking in terms of testing these structures. So I support what Bruce has been saying about kind of openness in terms of the results of exercises, and having an open discussion about how do we do this better for the next time, which inevitably there will be.
Thank you very much. And to Bruce.
Well, I'm an optimist. You've got to be in this business, but actually it's kind of the British way of doing things. As I said, actually we are good, or we can be good if you want to be, at doing this kind of thing. I would make just 2 points. The first of which is domestic, which is after the tragedies of 2001, we made a step change. And I hope, picking up Sarah's point about outliers, I think it's time for another step change. And I hope we can use this to make that step change in what we do in the UK. The trouble with black swans is they come in flocks, or whatever the collective term is for black swan. Just because we've had this one doesn't mean say we won't have another black swan or some other completely different type. So I think we've got to up our game. We shouldn't regard this as being a once in 50-year event. We are going to have more of these, point one. The other point is there's an international dimension to this. This is a global pandemic. Most of the major emergencies are global in nature. And I would hope that the British government, especially in global Britain, will take some kind of leadership role on the global level on learning lessons and improving.
Brilliant, and I think that's a good point to end it on. So massive, massive thank you to our panelists today. This has been a really interesting discussion, and to the audience for engaging with their questions. Just a very brief plug from me. Reform is actually doing work on this at the moment. So we are doing work on the resilience of government, not just in terms of emergency planning, but in terms of building resilience across all of our core public services. So please, if you would like to engage in that work with us, please do get in touch. Massive thank you again to our panel and to everyone who has been watching on Zoom and on YouTube. And we look forward to seeing you for the next event. Thank you very much, everyone.